Hello, and welcome back to ACRO's Good Clinical Podcast. I'm your host, Sophia McLeod. Today, I'm joined by Amy Kroeplin, Senior Director of Centralized Monitoring, RBQM Global Process Lead at PPD, the clinical research business of Thermo Fisher Scientific, Shailesh Madel, Director of Clinical Risk Management at ICON, and Nicole Stansbury, Senior Vice President, Global Clinical Operations at Premier Research. Amy, Shailesh, and Nicole are here today to discuss how their companies reduce 100% SDR and SDV effectively, and why doing so will result in better monitoring of clinical trials. Now, before we jump into the episode, I just want to do a quick level set on RBQM and SDR and SDV. Risk-based quality management of clinical trials is a targeted strategic approach to running clinical trials. The aim of RBQM is to focus monitoring and oversight activities on those trial processes most likely to affect participant safety and data quality, to enable clinical operations teams to mitigate risks or address errors quickly and effectively before they compromise trial outcomes. A core component of RBQM is the sampling of SDR and SDV. Centralized monitoring helps companies reduce or sample SDR and SDV by offering a holistic and comprehensive view of trial data, enabling faster deviation identification and reducing monitoring costs by up to 20%. Despite its potential to optimize clinical trials significantly, the industry has been slow to adopt centralized monitoring and shift away from traditional approaches like SDR and SDV. Nicole, Amy, and Shailesh are here to tell us how we actually make some progress in this area. Enjoy! I'm very lucky to be joined by Amy, Shailesh, and Nicole today to talk about some SDR, SDV sampling strategies. You guys have been doing this at your companies, and so we'd love to kind of let the audience know how you're reducing 100% SDR and SDV effectively, and why doing so will result in better monitoring of clinical trials. So to kick things off, Nicole, I've been told that you have a very fun farming metaphor for us. So one might say it's corny. That's probably the corniest joke I've ever made. So I'm glad that's been recorded. Do you want to walk us through your metaphor of how centralized monitoring is like growing a cornfield?
Sure. As a true Texan and graduate of an agricultural and mechanical school, I feel like I would not be doing my background justice if I didn't try to link things back to animals or farms or something in some way, shape, or form. So the way that I have been thinking about this for the last couple of years to try and get people to understand just the true volume we're talking about of data in the field. If you think about it, a kernel of corn, a single kernel of corn is a data point. Okay. A row of kernels on a single cob is a procedure. So that row of kernels are all the data that we collect on a single procedure. The cob itself is a patient visit. So we have 10, 12, 15 different procedures at any patient visit. And then a stalk of corn is a patient. And each patient is going to have 10, 12, 5, 6, however many patient visits. And then a row of corn is a site. And the entire field of corn is the study. If you think about it, when we ask our CRAs to do 100% SDR and SDV, we're asking them to go in this field of corn and inspect every kernel on every cob in every row and not miss anything. Or we criticize them for their lack of detail or their lack of attention, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of data in this field. In fact, I think Tufts has estimated on average for any given study, it's about 3.5 million data points, even more, I think, for oncology studies, according to Tufts. So there's a lot of data. And if we think about other ways that we could monitor that data, you know, if you think about central monitoring, for example, imagine like a drone flying over this field, being able to really point out to the CRAs, hey, at this site, way in the back on the left-hand side of this row, the last 3 plants, something isn't looking right. The plant is brown. I see evidence of really dry ground, or I see flooding in the 3rd row, first 7 plants. Or, you know, you can look and see mold and you can see pests that have come in and infiltrated your field. We need that high level perspective. That central monitoring element is a critical part of this that can help guide our CRAs into where in the field they need to spend their time and attention. And I think having people think about what we're really asking CRAs to do, and we're talking about 100% SDR and SDV, it's absurd if you think about it in terms of this cornfield.
No, this is such a great analogy. First of all, love a visual. So everyone who's actually watching the podcast is looking at this cornfield with us. Anyone listening, I would suggest you flip over to the YouTube because you can see this lovely slideshow. But it's also, I think, great to use an example totally outside of clinical research. I think, most people have driven by a cornfield and can kind of, pull up this visual in their mind. So I think this is a great level set for our discussion today to kind of frame the picture and the breadth of what we're talking about. I wanted to maybe flip to Amy and just sort of have you walk us through some of the different ways that companies can implement sampling strategies and, what this looks like.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is no standard. I think that's the message that, there's no one way to go about this. And while, the regulations talk about using a risk-based approach, the way that we need to think about how we design our strategy should come back to, does the strategy allow you to have confidence in the quality of the data that you're ultimately going to be submitting? And does it allow you to have that confidence that the site has adherence to the protocol, that ACRO principles have been met? And it really comes back to that data quality. So when you think about, Nicole's cornfield analogy, I'll try to use that as we talk about the different ways in which you can sample. You can see if you have that flyover view, how do you pick which row, which stalk of corn, which piece to look at? Well, risk assessment should be driving everything that you do. And as you evaluate those elements of the protocol, determining what is critical in terms of data and process is really that first step. And it's through that evaluation that then you can look at some of the common methodologies, subject sampling. So the holistic review of a whole subject record sampled from a group of subjects at a site is one mechanism. In that mechanism, it's probably best used when you're enrolling a lot of subjects at site, so you can get that idea by looking at a single one, what might be present in all the other subjects enrolled at that site. You see that in vaccine studies, for example, where they may be enrolling hundreds of subjects at a single location. Visit level is also very common, where you're selecting visits that have an abundance of critical data and critical process within it, and you're focusing on that individual visit on which to do your SDV and SDR sampling. So you have a very clear start and end point, beginning of the visit, end to the visit, and that's what you've sampled. We are also seeing a movement towards procedure level sampling. So procedure, or what would be the equivalent of a page from EDC data. So that is where you've got multiple critical data points associated with the completion of a procedure, and you're reviewing the whole procedure start to end. And then the lowest level of sampling is data point. So data point sampling is in reference to a single field within an EDC system. And this level of sampling is typically something that would be performed within an EDC system, where there's technology to actually sample at that field level with that concentrated effort on that individual single critical data point. And certainly, there are advantages and disadvantages to each of these types of strategy. But I think, one of the things that we need to think about when we're designing the approach is what's going to bring us the best quality? How can we have that confidence in the data that we're collecting, but also how can we be efficient about it? And the efficiency piece is often something that may be lost in those conversations. If we start building really complex sampling strategies, hunting and pecking through the record, if-then type statements of what to select, you make it really challenging to be compliant. And to make sure you're really getting at what you want. So technology should help drive that sampling approach as well, because it helps you be adherent to the strategy. I don't know, Nicole, I see you nodding your head. I know we've had conversations about that. Anything to add there?
The only thing I think I would add is that the FDA guidance from day one has said a sampling of critical data, a sampling of subject visits should be sufficient, because what we're looking for is not every tiny little inconsequential random error. We're looking for systemic errors.
Right.
We're looking for repetitive errors, things that are going to disrupt the quality of the overall data integrity. And I think that's really important. And I think the other thing I'd add is that when you go to like a data point or even a procedural level sampling and you're trying to manage that within an EDC system, that's also hard, because not all the data today even sits in the EDC system. There are some studies where, the primary endpoints don't even live in EDC. And so, we really need to think bigger picture, and we need to think about how data is also being stored today at sites in the source, in the medical record, because sampling starts with that. Any kind of sampling strategy has to start with what you review in the source and then how you compare that to the data that's been entered into whatever the system of record is that we're using for analysis. And you have to kind of think both ways about how data is being collected or stored on each of those ends.
And I think it lends itself too to sort of the shift we're seeing in the industry, moving away from SDV as being the primary focus and more on that SDR. So really focused on reviewing the source for process adherence, regulatory adherence, subject safety, over doing that transcription check, which really adds very little value. And for those reasons, with the shift to ePro, eCOA data as more often a critical data, endpoint data, that's really not data you're ever going to SDV. It's a focus on, did they collect the data following the process, following the protocol, and whatever was necessary for that patient or that participant. Did they have a chance to sit? Was the environment correctly? Did they eat? All of those things that go into ensuring that you're collecting the data well.
Yeah, and Shailesh, Amy, started talking kind of about that shift that we're seeing, but we do still, I think, often see SDR and SDV treated as a package deal in a lot of instances. And when we're thinking about implementing risk-based strategies, I'm wondering if you can kind of tell us how we separate the unique roles of SDR and SDV and what happens maybe if we try to reduce one without adjusting the other.
Thank you, Sophia. And before we dive into this question, I just wanted to add towards Amy's point there. So irrespective of whatever sampling strategies we use, we spoke about several different sampling strategies, but it's also important to understand, create that feedback loop. So it should not be like set it and forget it model of sampling strategy. Team has to revisit the sampling strategies. They might have thought, okay, I will go with 30% X, 40% X. We'll have central monitoring. We have KRIs. But it's also important to do that continuous review of our strategy and see the strategy which we have chosen. Is it really helping us identifying those quality issues early on? How is the data, right? And what is the feedback from other functional leads who are doing several different types of data review? So I think most importantly, so having that continuous review of our sampling strategies so that we don't set it and forget it, but also focus on revising our strategies.
Part of the risk base, right? I mean, that's inherent in, where are the risks and what do we need to do to adjust it to mitigate that risk? So absolutely agree.
So I've seen, teams do the risk assessment annually, or when there's a protocol amendment, they do the risk, they look at the mitigation, but when it comes to SDR, SDV sampling, it stays there. They don't look at the SDR, SDV sampling, but they would update the functional plan. They would look at different mitigation strategies. So that was the point. And I also say reduced SDV does not mean less oversight, or when we do sampling, it doesn't mean less oversight. It does mean that we have better, smarter, and optimized oversight because we are really optimizing with the sampling strategies. I will move on to my question. I think, Sophie, you were asking about SDR, SDV being clubbed as a package. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And we often see that happening, right? When we talk to our teams, they club SDR, SDV and say that let's do 50% SDV, SDR. Can we do that on this study? But in a risk-based strategy, it's also really important to understand SDV and SDR has two different roles to play. They are not the same. But often teams understand that they're a package deal. Let's do 50% SDV, SDR. That's our strategy, but that's not how it would work. While we all know SDV is more about transcription checking, it only checks the accuracy of a data point, that specific data, is it as per the source records, versus SDR is more deeper and it's more holistic because we are not just looking at a single data point, but data point in context. We are looking at if site is performing everything as per protocol standards, as per quality, as per GCP compliance. So SDR really gives us a confidence that site is performing this trial as per the standard operating procedure of site, as per quality standards, as per protocol standards, as per GCP compliance. So therefore, they both are really different in the way they are done at site and the outcome which they give us. Also, we have seen a lot of studies by now, including translate study, where we see that really the SDV is not adding a lot of value. We have seen SDV really turns into 1 to 2% of critical changes, which is not really adding value. On the other hand, SDR is. So when we reduce SDV, it's really important that we have a strong backup in plan. So for instance, if you're reducing SDV, there's a higher volume of SDR being done and also backed by central monitoring. It's not just let's reduce something, but what is the backup plan? If you're reducing SDV, do we have SDR in place to ensure that we have enough oversight? And if you're reducing SDR, what do you have? Your central monitoring, your KRIs and QTLs. How do we ensure that whenever we are reducing SDV, there is SDR in place? Because SDR would do at a site level. We'll get a confidence the site is doing good. And then having central monitoring to back it up at across study level, across sites to see how different sites are performing with the help of central monitoring. Over a period of time, we have seen that the impact of SDV not adding value, but the impact of targeted SDV focusing on critical data and risk definitely adds a lot of efficiency to the study backed by SDR and central monitoring. We should also think about right sizing SDV and SDR reductions, sampling strategies, so that depending upon the study need, what matters most for the success of that trial. And to bring confidence in the reduction of SDR, SDV sampling strategies, I think, Amy, you also alluded to this. To bring that confidence, it really starts as a collaborative effort by all functional leads. It's not one team's decision. It's not like a CRA, CTM, or ClinOps decision, but it's a team's decision to come together and identify what are my critical to quality factors for this study, what is critical data and processes, and what are those risks. And who is going to look at the data? Is it data management? Is it central monitoring? Is it medical monitoring? And then what do we need CRS to look at? Who will look at data first than a CRA going to a site after a few weeks? So really having this collaborative effort from the team to identify who will do what, who will do first versus who will do last, then the sampling strategy or the SDR, SDV reduction strategy comes into play when team decides that I'm going to look at this data, so I'm giving you confidence that as a CRA, you don't have to look at this data because I've got you. I have a KRI for this. I have a QTL for this. So you don't have to look at all the data. But here is the data which I don't have visibility remotely or centrally. I can't look at this data. So when you go at site, please look at this data for me. So when team works together in identifying that strategy, that really gives confidence that, yes, we are looking at everything and we are not missing on something. And central monitoring is very key role here. But what we are also seeing is central monitoring is also getting siloed, right? I'm a central monitor. I look at data, but not everyone is engaged there. So as a CRAs, if they also have access to not just a signal and a finding, but overall visualization, CRA gets in confidence that when I'm going to a site, I don't have to look at everything, but I know these are the signals which I'm looking at. So that's really what I think of reducing the SDV, SDR, how it's a team effort and how important it is. So reduced SDV, SDR does not mean less oversight. We have to repeat this, but it means we are doing better, smarter, and optimized oversight for a success of trial.
I mean, it goes back to why you're selecting what you are for sampling. I think, too often nowadays anyway, we're seeing this desire to heavily reduce SDV without accompanying SDR necessarily. So, making sure that the team understands the decision of why you're just going to do a transcription check when the data is considered critical is something that should be discussed cross-functionally and be part of that risk assessment. Because if the data is critical, you'd think you'd want to also verify that the process by which that data was collected was sound. So having those conversations up front, cross-functionally with the sponsor, I think, as you've stated, is really, really important.
I agree with that, Amy. I think there's a misconception that by significantly reducing SDV, you're getting some sort of super efficient cost savings. And that's not the case, because if you're still doing 100% SDR or near 100% SDR, you're not really getting much cost savings at all. Back between 2007 and 2010, I ran some time trials of different sampling approaches where we had sister studies. There was same exact protocol. We had one team doing one sampling methodology or 100%, and the other team doing a different sampling methodology and another. And they kept time of how much time they spent in the source and how much time they spent on actual SDV activities in the EDC system. And the hunting and pecking, the scavenger hunt approach, which it was super time intensive. It actually took more time to do a data point sampling than it did to do 100% SDR and SDV, without a doubt. It was probably like 1.3 times the amount of time it took to do just traditional SDR, SDV. And so when we think about a sampling approach and how SDR and SDV fit together, that's why we landed on a subject visit sampling approach, because on a data point sampling approach, you're probably going to end up having to open every record for every patient at every visit. So imagine going into that cornfield and having to at least open up within each stalk every corn cob on that plant to find a couple of those data points. Same with the procedure or form level, but not as bad, because it's just easier to pinpoint where that is. And you get the more holistic, how did this whole thing happen? And did it happen correctly in association with the other visits or other procedures during the visit? We went with a subject visit sampling approach because you can then not open the corn cobs on some of the plants. And there's a way that can become more efficient from that perspective in looking at it. But, I do think the corn analogy does help when you're trying to figure out, like, how much time is this really saving? If you think about it in terms of the corn analogy, you can really start to say, okay, if our desired outcome is efficiency and high quality, this sampling method is going to be the approach. If it's just, let's try a sampling method and we don't care about how much time or efficiency it is, then think about it in terms of that corn analogy, and it can help you kind of come to some of those conclusions about what makes sense.
I wanted to ask you a little bit, just, what you're seeing in the regulatory space. We talk a lot about what's going on both in the US and globally. At ACRO, I know you guys obviously have talked about this within the RBQM working group and I'm sure the other coalitions you are a part of. But Amy, maybe I'll just toss it to you first, and then Nicole and Shailesh, please jump in. But what have we seen from regulators around the world on the topic of approaches to reducing SDR and SDV?
I think this is the challenge, right? Is that there is no clear guidance other than taking a risk-based approach, which can mean many things. And, you heard from our conversation about all the different ways you can approach sampling. That's the level of variety that we're seeing out there from our sponsors, with all different approaches or ideas about what they think the right strategy is. And I think what we need to do as an industry is to start providing some agreed upon guidance on at least the approach, how to think about setting the right strategy. What are the pros and cons? What are the risks to the different types of strategies out there, so we can sort of level that playing field? From an auditor or inspector perspective, my experience has been they just want to see it tied back to risk. How did you come up with the strategy, and is it tied back to your risk assessment? But I can't say that I've seen much in the way of auditors or inspectors sort of tearing into or challenging the type of sampling that was chosen necessarily. I don't know, Nicole or Shailesh, if you've seen anything from your perspectives on that front.
No, not at all. In fact, I mean, in all the discussions we've had with regulators, whether it's the FDA and Duke Margolis School of Public Health Policy meeting on RBM, which we've had twice now, or other just feedback from regulators, even when we have like listening sessions with them, their feedback is, you guys do this day in, day out. We don't. You guys are the experts. We're telling you, you don't have to do 100% SDR and SDV. We don't care about random error. What we care about is systematic failure to protect the data or the patients in the trial. That's what they care about. And so however we, as the experts in the industry, I mean, CROs run hundreds of trials. Even pharma companies do not run as many trials per year at any given time than some of the large CROs do. By far, large CROs have a tremendous amount of experience in this and a lot of feedback from regulators and actual inspector of CRO inspections, sponsor inspections, and site inspections. And we're not seeing findings related to, you didn't select the right sampling plan. What we see findings on are you didn't follow your plan. Even if it was 100% SDR and SDV, you didn't follow your plan. So that, I think, number one is making sure whatever your plan is to have documentation in a traceable way to show that you actually followed your plan. To Shailesh's earlier point, you need to show that you reacted or changed something in your plan and strategy when you found something that was unexpected, because you can't predict every risk on day one of the study. Patients are humans, sites are humans, and lots of weird, crazy things happen in a study, and we have to be able to react. We have to be able to show that we react with some logical, critical thinking skills in order to protect the patients and the integrity of the trial as we go along. So I think those are two things. I've really not seen any regulator, whether it be MHRA, EMA, or FDA, come at us for missing some data here or there from an SDR SDV perspective. I think what, I have seen them get into a lot of questions around big systemic issues in the data that you didn't have to do SDR and SDV to take a step back and see. Anyone looking at data centrally could have seen it, could have detected it, and could have said, hey, this looks weird. Let's follow up and do some investigation. I've seen that happen. And I think that goes to the point of, the SDR and SDV piece isn't the piece where they're focusing on now. I think our attention should be on what central monitoring we have in place to pick up on those same trends and systematic issues that the regulators are picking up on today. And that, to me, is what I want to pay more attention to: the reacting, the following the plan, and having a capable central monitoring strategy.
No, I agree fully with Nicole and Amy, and you're right. We have seen findings, but those findings would have still come even if you would have done 100% SDR and SDV, because those are the findings really could have been catched by central monitoring or data management or medical monitoring. You don't need a CRA to be at site to get those findings. And in our view, I think in my view, it's more about to have a documented rationale why we reduce SDV and SDR at a patient level, at a data point level. What is the rationale? And I just referenced some time back the Translarate's template for documenting risk-based monitoring approach. They have come up with this template, and I think it's really good template we are exploring internally to see how we can use. It's a template which shows and documents what is our risk-based monitoring approach, including on-site monitoring, remote monitoring, central monitoring, medical monitoring, and data management. What is that you're going to look at it? Who is going to look at it? I think we all have this type of document, but it's in different places, and this document is trying to pull everything together so that we can show regulators what is our approach and how it has been changed over the course of study if we have changed, and also giving them evidence if we have reduced something, how we have backed it up with central monitoring. It's a big piece, and with the key risk indicators and QTLs, if we have the right KRIs and QTLs in place, we would avoid most of those inspection findings at site, something which is not GCP compliant. So I think that's really my take on what regulators are looking for.
I think, again, it speaks to, how do you back up what your strategy is through the risk assessment? And again, not doing something so complex that you can't be compliant with the strategy you came up with, because a complex strategy isn't necessary in this space.
Backing up, one of the other things that Amy said that I would add to my list of things that regulators care about, and that is bringing non-compliant sites back into compliance with their process. So the faster that we can detect, the most important thing is that we detect that the site has an issue. Let's say that they had, 12 patients, and we see on the first 3 patients that we've looked at visit 1, they did something incorrectly. That is what we've got to focus on. I would immediately stop all the other detailed review of stuff and let's go check the other patients' visit 1s or whatever the case is that we know that they've messed up the first 3 times. Let's check the other 12 patients and let's immediately work with that site to bring them back into compliance, whether it is reassessing their process, changing their process, putting some guardrails in place, putting some quality checks in at certain time points, retraining the person who did it. Whatever the case may be, we need to show effort from a monitoring perspective that we've done everything to bring that site back into compliance and prevent reoccurrences of whatever that issue was that was happening. And I'll be honest with you, because of 100% SDR and SDV requirements, a lot of times CRAs are running out of time in the field when they do find an issue to actually do the bringing the site back into compliance, because they're trying to finish the SDR and SDV requirements that they were supposed to do. And that is the wrong focus. If we see something has gone sideways, that needs to be our priority in making sure that we're bringing sites back into compliance. And if that means putting the site on a screening hold until they've corrected the problem, whether it is just really working with the site on a CAPA process internally, those are the things that we need our CRAs spending the time on, because no one else is going to do that job. That squarely sits on the shoulders of a CRA to bring those sites back into compliance. We can all, to Shailesh's earlier point, we can all share the load of reviewing data. There are lots of team members centrally, whether it be data management, central monitors, statisticians, medical monitors, that can help on the data review part. But the part that only the CRA can perform is that bringing the sites back into compliance. And that's what we want them to spend their time on, not going through that field, shucking every cob of corn, looking at every data point. That's not what we want them to do.
No, I agree. Most of the time, CRS focus is, I have X number of SDV to complete, X number of SDR to complete, and they're already aging. It's been open since X days. Let me go there, finish this off. And then they miss on the actual SDR process, or as you said, working with site to bring them up to the speed, to bring them to compliant.
Yeah, they're focused on the corn cob and they can't see the whole row.
Exactly. See, where would we be without this metaphor? Nicole, this is great. I wanted to end on sort of a future looking question, just sort of where are we going with all of this? Where would you like us to be going? So the ACRO RBQM landscape survey data shows that 50% of studies that were outsourced to CROs in 2024 utilized centralized monitoring. So Nicole, maybe I'll start with you and then please everyone chime in. Where would you like to see this level of adoption in the future? And what do you think it will take for the industry to actually get there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a balancing act. It really is. And each new thing you add to a study, it's an investment. It costs money. So if only 50% of the studies are using central monitoring, I say we've got to up that to 100%. 100% of studies need to be using central monitoring in some way, shape, or form. And it does not have to be fancy technology. It could be as mundane, really, as someone centrally flipping through case report form pages, or looking through listings, or going into each EPRO or other system and looking at data and trying to put points together to find systematic issues and errors. That's a very basic level of what I would call central monitoring. More sophisticated aggregation of that data into visualizations that allow you to see discrepancies and pull data in different places together into one so that you can see those better. That's more of what I think the norm in the mainstream central monitoring is, but that costs money some. It doesn't have to be expensive to implement. But in order to pay for that, really you should be doing your reduced SDR and SDV, because you can offset those costs. And in fact, in many cases, you can offset the costs so that the central monitoring with the technology and the reduced SDR and SDV actually is a lower cost option than your traditional monitoring. And you're still getting high level of quality on the things that matter. And you're getting the CRAs to focus their time on the process improvements needed at the site and the overall oversight. But I would like to see 100% of studies using central monitoring. I would like to see really 100% of studies using an SDR SDV sampling strategy. But it doesn't have to be a 20% sampling strategy. If your company is nervous about it, start with like a 70% sampling strategy. And then when you're more confident, move to a 50% sampling strategy. One day in the future, I'd love for it to be something like, I don't know, maybe a 10 to 15% sampling strategy, supplemented by CRAs just following up on all the different central monitoring findings at the site that are pinpointing you to those areas in that field where something looks off, and spending their time investigating those.
I think that we're at a pivotal moment with technology where we're going to see the entire monitoring landscape change over the next 5 years. I mean, whether you're talking about the use of AI or modeling to have more predictive analytics about where you should be looking, where the problems are, whether that's through central monitoring or even on-site monitoring, the shift to more digital sources is going to even further reduce what we consider SDV to be and how monitoring should be performed. So I really think that when we meet again in 5 years, we're going to be having a completely different conversation, because whether you call it central monitoring or not, we're going to be leveraging technology to remotely evaluate data in a different way, and very likely to be using AI and modeling to do a lot of that in the future. And the on-site activity, I think, will also shift in a different direction, perhaps even in a more supportive way from a site process perspective, as the shift away from SDV happens, especially as we look at EHR integration with EDC and some of the other technological advances that we're seeing.
Yep, I agree. And what really matters is we are also trying to advocate 100% central monitoring on all studies. So all studies should have central monitoring. We are trying to push and advocate that with a lot of data. But while we do that, also we need to ensure that we have fit for purpose technology. As Nicole said, we cannot have a one big central monitoring platform and every study to adopt it when it's a phase 1 study. versus a phase 3 study. So a fit for purpose technology, which is adaptable, low cost versus serves the need, right? So having that fit for purpose technology will allow everyone to onboard on the central monitoring and not just the high budget studies. So fit for purpose technology. And then also, Emmy, as you said, use of AI, that's going to come in, use of natural language processing or machine learning. We are trying to do something around it as a proof of concept to see now, while someone manually looking at different source of data and then predicting that, oh, this site is at risk, let's send CR to this site, versus and machine learning doing that, reading the SAE narratives, looking at all the action items, reading the monitoring visit report, and telling us there is a site which has a problem. When you have this type of digital visualization available, then yes, so this SDR, SDV sampling will be very easy. It will not be complex. It will be very simple because we are not running it through an Excel sheet, but rather in a digital system visualized way to go to site. So that shift, I think, is coming soon. And we also need to ensure that we upskill our workforce in using these technologies, right? And the CONCOB field, we said drone. So that drone is going to be really this AI, which will be like a drone. Instead of CRA going to site, this AI is going to site and reviewing all the things, and then just send CRA only when there is absolute need for a CRA to be on site.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's my hope anyway for the future.
I think we'll get there.
Yep, it's soon, very soon.
Yeah. The future is here.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thanks for tuning in to ACRO's Good Clinical Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this rather corny episode. A huge thanks to Shailesh, Amy, and Nicole for joining me, and be sure to check back in next week for episode 5.